16. Narrowly escaped doctor's office kidnapping. When I was 16 years old, I decided to surprise my parents with a bouquet of flowers for Valentine's Day. We've always celebrated this as a family holiday rather than a romantic one. I didn't have a car to drive to a florist, but my high school was within walking distance of a hospital, boasting a gift shop that sells floral arrangements. Between classes during the week of Valentine's Day, I set off for the hospital by my lonesome, cutting across campus to walk through a network of side roads populated with specialty doctors' offices that keep odd hours, the sort of buildings where traveling doctors mainly hold surgery consultations or perform small procedures a few times a month. The trip there passed without incident. As I was walking back through said deserted roads with a vase of flowers in tow, I noticed an unkept 1990s car close behind me. While my memory of the car is hazy, I am left with the impression that there were at least two men within those faces I could not see. Initially, I assumed that the driver was simply afraid of hitting me, the reason they weren't passing by. So I made a point of dramatically trudging further into the grassy shoulder of the road, demonstrating to them they could safely drive ahead. They still refused to pass me by, continuing to creep along behind at a slow pace. Beginning to suspect that the driver was more interested in me than a destination, I began to walk faster. The car confirmed my suspicions by matching my speed. Despite the impracticality of my shoes and the threat of spilling water from my vase, I commenced to run as fast as I possibly could. They hit the gas and again matched my speed. I realized at this point that the car was following me, that there was no one in sight to notice, and I needed to get away. I bolted into the first parking lot that I saw. The car turned in after me, despite there being only 2 or 3 cars in the spacious front parking lot and there being no other sign of activity at the office. This car did not stop to park in the numerous spaces available there. The driver instead opted to pursue me into the partially under construction back portion of this lot behind the office. It passed every available parking space to corner me against a pile of debris and rubble from the construction, coming to a diagonal stopless, then 3 feet away. Before anyone could emerge from the vehicle, I somehow managed to scale the small prominence of rubble against my back, vase in hand, and jumped from its peak to land painfully on the other side, which fortunately was a plot of undeveloped land within sight of my high school campus. I took a quick peek back over my shoulder to see if they were still in pursuit, but the car had sped off after I reached the top of the rubble pile and was now nowhere in sight. They had not parked in the lot at all. They had no business there. The driver was following me. I sprinted at top speed and didn't stop until I was soaked with sweat in the dead of winter and panting in the student lounge among my classmates who didn't seem to give a damn when I told them, possibly because our hometown is supposedly a human trafficking capital and the crime rate is outrageous, although I am convinced that there was something more informal than human trafficking, as the dilapidated car suggested poverty, and I have read human trafficking usually arises through grooming and not being snatched off the streets. In retrospect, I should have told an adult, alerted campus security, and called the non-emergency line of the local police station. But I was young, foolish, insecure, and afraid of getting in trouble for leaving campus when I didn't have a signed permission form permitting me to do so. I kept trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation or was overreacting. I don't know what I would have even told the police had I called them, as I was entirely ignorant on the subject of cars and couldn't have identified the make of it had I been asked, and I couldn't see the faces of the occupants. I was also worried that my parents would restrict my already extremely limited freedoms if they knew I had been in any danger. I feel horrible for having never told anyone, and earnestly hope that my secrecy hasn't led to someone being hurt or killed. I believe the only missing person aside from runaway children or elderly adults with dementia in this city right now though are men, aside from one woman a few decades ago. Whoever followed and tried to trap a 16-year-old girl with flowers at a doctor's office just before Valentine's Day of 2016. Let's not meet. My best friend was really my worst enemy. Warnings, abuse, emotional abuse, gaslighting, self-harm, internalized transphobia, suicide mention, and suicidal idealization. So, to start out this story, I was best friends with a girl named Charlie for 3 years. I loved her, and I thought she loved me, but that wasn't true. 5th grade, primary school. Back in 5th grade, I had just been transferred to a new school. The whole class knew each other from the year before, and I was a complete outcast. I met Charlie at the school's open house, and apparently we sat at the same table. She was really nice and bubbly, and said she'd like to get to know me. I wanted a friend, and she was there. Sparing the details of awkward preteens trying to get through school, we became fast friends. We got each other's Skype and we talked day and night. We called nearly every day and would just talk for hours. She made me laugh and we could talk about anything. I also became friends with Charlie's friends, Catherine and Edison. We were a group of kids and had fun, but things changed subtly over time. Charlie became more depressed, mentioning she'd been diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders. I did my best to comfort her. What are friends for? I assured her a diagnosis didn't change anything, and it's a good thing she's getting help for the issues. She agreed, but I don't think she really believed it. I'm not entirely sure when it started, but Charlie started venting to me about her emotions. I always listened and tried to help when I could find the words. I was her shoulder to cry on, and I was happy I could help her in some way. It felt like repaying her for picking up the new nobody who wandered into her friend group. She never got better though. She started to get more extreme and more serious breakdowns. She would call herself worthless, claiming she could tell her parents hated her. I'd met her parents by that point, and they were loving people. They clearly cared about her, and I told her so. She called me a liar, saying I should leave her to self-destruct and stop pretending I care. I was heartbroken, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The next day at school, she seemed to be doing better, smiling and joking with our friends. I tried to ask her about the night before. She got a very serious look on her face, and she sounded angry, telling me that it doesn't matter anymore. I didn't pry, figuring she would talk about it later. That night I asked her again, but I got a similar answer from before. I was confused, but just went with it. I wish I hadn't. It went for months like that, her breaking down, spiraling, calling me a liar, a cheat, and saying I hated her guts. Every attempt to comfort her or deny the accusations were met with liar. It became routine. Charlie broke the routine by adding something new. She started to openly hurt herself in school. When she messed up, answered a question wrong, or sometime for no reason, she'd take a mechanical pencil and start scratching her arm, holding it just to show me and her friends exactly what she was doing. Whenever we tried to stop her, she'd snap at us, saying to stop pretending we care and to shut up or don't touch me. We didn't know what to do. We were just kids. The summer after 5th grade went pretty well. She seemed to be getting a bit better, with less spiraling and breakdowns. We talked every day, and before we knew it, the summer was over. 6th grade, middle school. We were a year older and in a new school. We were still a group. Me, Charlie, Catherine, and Addison. This is when Charlie got worse again. She started having breakdowns during school and openly self-harming more. I was constantly worried for her. I don't think there was a full day that whole year that I could relax and not worry about her hurting herself. If memory serves, I have a lot of trouble remembering these years in detail. It was the year she first messaged me saying she wanted to kill herself. She explained how she would do it and how easy it would be and how no one would care she was gone. I was crying, hysterically trying to calm her down and say how much I cared about her and how I didn't know what I'd do without her. She ended the conversation saying she wouldn't do it. I was beyond relieved and made sure to check up with her the next day at school. She insisted that it wasn't that bad and that I had overreacted. I still insisted she be honest about those feelings and tell an adult if she was really thinking about suicide. Charlie promised me she would. The rest of the year remained pretty consistent, with a steady incline in severity of her breakdowns, but slow enough that I hardly noticed the change. 7th grade, middle school. This was the year shit really hit the fan. This year is very fuzzy in my memory, so I'll have to just hit the main points. Charlie was starting to struggle in school. When she was immediately great at something, she gave up. She just stopped trying. The open self-harm got worse, going as far as to shout at me if I tried to stop her. She was still my best friend. I love her, and she loved me, right? We could talk to each other about anything, except when I tried to vent to her, she'd say I was making it all about me, or that she couldn't handle it right then. If she was having trouble and I tried to relate to her issue and give advice, she'd say I was making it about myself and that I'm not her parent. This year, I started to really question my gender. I met my actual best friend and now platonic partner, Liz. We were two broken trans kids, so deep in the closet we couldn't admit we were trans. Liz was the first to come out, and I welcomed her with open arms, gushing about how much stuff we could do together. Charlie didn't like Liz. She was clearly jealous and thought Liz was taking me from her. I reassured her that I still cared about her and that she was still my number one, but she didn't believe me. About the middle of the school year, Charlie said she might have a crush on me, and she asked if I would be opposed to being her romantic partner. At that time, I was very in denial about my sexuality, a romantic asexual, and said I wouldn't mind it. She seemed to take this as me consenting to some kind of relationship. She became much more touchy, hugging me and even kissed my head or forehead a few times. I didn't know why at the time, but these actions made me incredibly uncomfortable, and I wanted to shrivel up and hide. I now know it's because I'm touch averse, but at the time, I hated myself for these reactions. I beat myself up inside for recoiling from my best friend, and how dare I get grossed out. I very quickly fessed up to the discomfort, telling her that I didn't actually want to date her and that we weren't together, and that I wasn't comfortable with the amount of physical contact she was giving. She seemed understanding, apologizing for being touchy and even joking a bit about being touch-starved. After that, she started to get really distant when we were in person, and not just physical distance. She seemed to avoid talking to me for long and made any excuse to shut me up. The nightly routine of breakdown Russian roulette of whether it be a couple sentences or 4 hours continued. Warning: this section forward talks about suicide threats. There were a few different times she threatened suicide. More than once, she said it'd be my fault. One particularly standout night, She sent me a video. There was Charlie, sitting in her bathroom next to the toilet. Paraphrased, "It would be so easy for me to just end it. I could drown myself in the toilet and no one would know. It'd be quiet and no one would care. My parents don't give a shit." I texted her over and over again, begging for her to not do it, saying I loved her, her parents love her, and that I'd miss her. I cried so much I got dehydrated. I stayed up past midnight just waiting for her to respond, but she didn't. I thought she was dead. I thought she had killed herself and it was my fault, that I should have gotten to her sooner. I cried myself to sleep that night. When I got to school, I saw her walking into class and my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. I ran up and hugged her. I wept and I begged her for an answer, asking where she had been, saying I thought she died. Paraphrased. She chuckled. "Geez, I'm sorry. I forgot to check my phone last night." It felt like everything stopped. I just stared at her. This person who I'd loved for years now, who I looked after, talked to, cared for, and couldn't live without, just laughed about it. I didn't know what to say. I was so dumbfounded that I just tried to act normal. My whole view of her shattered that day, and it was the beginning of the end. That year droned on, and I slowly started to push away from Charlie. I still cared deeply for her, but I couldn't take it anymore. Her breakdowns and ramblings and venting was daily, and I just couldn't handle her berating me. I felt terrible, like I was abandoning her. It felt like leaving a person with a broken foot to walk 1,000 stairs themselves. But I had to get away. I started talking to our mutual friends about what she did and was doing. They said that it was terrible and couldn't believe she would say such things. I showed them the conversations, feeling even more guilty for showing off our private texts to other people. I had to prove it though. I had to make them believe me. In the end, I did get away from Charlie. I think my other friends did too, but they didn't do much for me. They shut me out, and while I was broken, healing from a 3 years long wound, they talked about me behind my back, added fuel to my fire, only to tell me that I've only ever talked about Charlie. I lost pretty much all my friends that year. I tried to resettle back into my group of friends at first, but it wasn't the same as before. I was constantly worried that they were talking about me behind my back, and I was terrified that they saw me to be on the same level as Charlie. So I left that group. It was for the best in the end. It's been a few years now, and I can say with certainty that I have trauma from those years of abuse. This post is by no means detailed enough to capture the horrific experience that was my time as Charlie's friend, but I don't want to reopen old wounds. I am still great friends with Liz, and she honestly saved me from Charlie's reign of terror. Her kindness and friendship contrasted with Charlie's everything, woke me up to how awful it was. I don't hate Charlie, despite all that she did to me. She was a terrible person and an absolute monster of a human, but we were just kids. I know that I'm not the same person I was back then, and I figure that she isn't either. Everyone deserves a second chance in life, but Charlie, let's never meet again. Edit. I wanted to add some clarity and specify some of Charlie's actions. I tried to paint broad strokes, but it seems my vagueness has led to some people deciding my post doesn't quite fit here. So, let's begin. Warnings, all above still apply. Charlie was on antidepressants starting in the summer post 5th grade. She often blamed her outburst on her unfit medication or stating, "I forgot to take my meds." I later found out she had been lying. Her parents ensured she took her medication at the right time each night, and her forgetting was a complete lie used to excuse her actions. Later in the timeline of abuse, 7th grade, she would say things like, Don't even try. She'll be back soon. Referring to herself during a mental spiral or breakdown as a different person. This is also when she started to claim to not remember doing the things she did during the breakdowns. I know for a fact she was lying about this because in private she would admit to remembering and say how she's not really two different people. Every time it was just used as excuses for her to be a horrible person. More often than not, she told me it would be my fault if she killed herself. If I left her, whatever she did to herself afterwards would be my fault. And if I stopped being her friend, it would prove her right. So I stayed. Those few nights that she stopped talking abruptly, I was horrified that she had died and it would be my fault. I thought her parents would get mad at me, screaming and crying at me for killing their daughter. But that day never came. I got out. I escaped her iron grip, and I have never been more thankful for having true friends who love me. I truly don't know where I'd be now if I had stayed. During 8th grade, she was still in my school. We had the same math class each morning, and I did everything possible to ignore her. Sometimes I would see her in the hall or at lunch, and I just couldn't bring myself to look at her. At one point, we were outside on break, and she was right next to me, but I couldn't look at her face. It felt like if I were to look, my eyes would burn, like looking directly at the sun. It would be easy to hate her for everything she did to me and others, but hatred only breeds contempt. I do hope she has found a better life, but I dearly hope, for my sake, that we never meet again.